Ever feel like your brain is waging a war against your to-do list? You know that feeling, right?
Yeah.
You're all set to conquer the day, then bam, suddenly you're like 20 cat videos deep, and that big report is still giving you the side eye from your desk.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Well, get ready to dive deep today because we're tackling procrastination. But forget those motivational posters and rah-rah speeches. We're going straight to the source, your
Yeah.
brain. And trust me, we've got some seriously interesting research that just might help you outsmart those procrastination gremlins.
It's true, and something people often get wrong about procrastination is that it's about laziness, but really it all comes down to how our brains are wired.
Okay, so Brain Wiring 101, for those of us who feel like our brains are working against us, not with us, break it down for us.
So imagine this. There's this thing called your limbic system. Think of it as your brain's instant gratification center. All it cares about is right now, this very second. It craves pleasure and avoids anything that even hints at difficulty, and it wants it all immediately.
Sounds a lot like my inner monologue, if I'm being honest.
Right. Then, on the other side, you've got your prefrontal cortex, which is like your strategic planner. It's the part of you that thinks about long-term goals, consequences, the bigger picture. The only issue is that when we're faced with something we don't want to do, that limbic system, it throws a tantrum, and unfortunately, more often than not, it wins.
So it's like that little devil on my shoulder is actually my limbic system throwing a rave, and meanwhile, my poor prefrontal cortex is just trying to focus, drowning it all out with noise-canceling headphones. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, but how do we actually use that to our advantage?
Well, there's this fascinating thing called temptation bundling, and it's kind of exactly what it sounds like, a way to make your brain actually want to do those things that it normally resists.
Oh, tell me more about this.
So this behavioral economist, Katie Milkman, came up with it, and it's kind of brilliant in how simple it is. You basically take something you really love, like, say, listening to a new true crime podcast,
Already hooked.
and you only allow yourself to listen to it while you're doing something you usually put off.
Hold on, are you saying I can actually trick myself into, like, enjoying cleaning the bathroom if I associate it with something I actually want to do?
Yep. You're basically using your limbic system's love of immediate pleasure to, well, your advantage. And the research is really interesting. Temptation bundling can actually make you over 50% more likely to stick with those should-do tasks.
Wow, 50%, that's huge. Okay, so for everyone listening who, like me, is already trying to come up with their perfect pairings, what are some examples of temptation bundling that really work? I'm all about maximizing those dopamine hits, you know?
Totally. Well, I actually know someone who loves listening to audiobooks, but they only let themselves listen while running on the treadmill.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And guess what? Their once dreaded workout routine is now their favorite part of the day. Or you could try only watching your favorite show while folding laundry, or listening to that new album you love while, say, answering emails.
I love those. So it's about finding what genuinely excites you and then linking it to a task you'd usually avoid.
Yeah.
And the key is being consistent,
Yeah.
right? Like really making it a rule so that your brain starts to build that positive association.
Exactly. Think of it like retraining your brain, those neural pathways to make those positive connections. But there's also another strategy, and this might sound a little counterintuitive, but it really taps into the way our brains are wired. The nothing alternative method. And yes, you heard that right. Sometimes the best thing you can do to be productive is to actually do nothing.
Okay, you're going to have to explain this one because do nothing sounds an awful lot like what my brain wants to do all the time. And that's not usually very productive.
Right. It does sound a little too good to be true, but that's the beauty of it. It's so simple, And actually, it was this crime novelist, Raymond Chandler, who really popularized this technique.
Oh, interesting.
And you can imagine writing, it's like the ultimate battle against procrastination, right? Words, blank page, all that.
For sure. So what did he do? Just stare at a blank page when he couldn't think of anything to write?
Basically. He realized that if he was stuck, the most productive thing he could do was give himself permission to do absolutely nothing.
Really?
Yep, he would sit down to write for a set amount of time, but if the words just weren't coming to him, he wasn't allowed to do anything else, no reading, no chores, nothing. Just sit there.
Wow. And so by, like, staring into the void, his brain was like, wait, actually, maybe writing isn't so bad after all.
Yes, exactly. You've got it. It's about outsmarting that limbic system. Remember how we talked about it, how much it hates boredom? Well, it hates boredom as much as it hates doing something unpleasant. So when you take away all the other options, you're basically forcing it to choose between, well, the task and nothing.
Interesting.
And most of the time, that task starts to seem way more appealing.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like hitting the reset button. So what about when it's a really big project, though? That feeling of just being completely overwhelmed. Because our research also mentioned something about microtasks and procrastination. Tell me about that.
Yes, so that ties right back in to the whole way our brains are wired, you see. When we're looking at something big and daunting, it's like our limbic system just freaks out
Oh, yeah.
and it goes into that avoid at all costs mode. But if we can trick our brains into thinking about a task as these smaller, manageable chunks, we can sort of sidestep that limbic system freak out and make some actual progress.
I like the sound of that.
It's all about breaking things down into those baby steps, like tiny little 20, maybe 30-minute tasks at most.
So instead of write a whole podcast episode, it's research one interesting thing, write an intro, that kind of thing.
Yes. And here's the cool part. When you complete one of those really tiny tasks, your brain, it actually releases dopamine, the reward chemical, which, makes you feel good. And that feeling then reinforces this feeling of, I can do this. Oh, I am all about that dopamine. So it's like you're basically giving yourself a mini celebration for each little step, which makes you want to keep going.
Exactly. It's about hijacking that reward system so it works for you, not against you. And those small wins, they build this amazing momentum and convince your brain that, hey, this isn't actually so bad. In fact, maybe I'm even good at this. And without even realizing it, you've made all this progress, but you've bypassed that initial overwhelm.
Wow, okay, so we're not writing a to-do list anymore. We're writing a how to outsmart your brain guide.
That's a great way to put it.
But let's personalize this even more. Our research also talked about how important it is to figure out what your own procrastination triggers are. So what's the deal with that? It's like we're figuring out our procrastination kryptonite, right? Because what makes me procrastinate is probably totally different than what makes you procrastinate. Absolutely, yeah. Some people, it's boredom, but for others, it might be fear of failure or maybe just feeling overwhelmed because they don't have enough structure. But, and this is the good news, once you know what your triggers are, you can come up with ways to deal with them.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? Like, are we talking, what, keeping a procrastination journal or something?
Yeah.
Analyzing all our to-do list fails? Give me the specifics.
Well, those aren't bad ideas, actually. Seriously, paying attention to those patterns is huge,
Mm-hmm.
Like next time you find yourself procrastinating, just take a second and think about what's going on. What are you doing instead of the task you should be doing? What's going through your head? Any particular emotions? Are there specific types of tasks that make you procrastinate, or even just times of day when you're more likely to fall into that trap?
So, like, we're treating procrastination like a science experiment. We're gathering data on our own brains.
I love that. Yes. And once you have that data, you can start experimenting, right? So let's say you realize you're most likely to procrastinate when you just feel completely overwhelmed. So that's your trigger. Well, now that you know that, you can try breaking down those bigger tasks into those smaller micro steps, the ones we talked about earlier. Or maybe you set a timer and work in short bursts with breaks planned in.
Okay, this is making so much sense. So we're not beating ourselves up for procrastinating.
Right.
We're using it as information
Exactly.
to work smarter, not harder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because remember, conquering procrastination, it's not about turning into some kind of productivity machine. It's about feeling less stressed, feeling more in control, and making room for the things that really matter.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to work with our brains, not against them.
Yeah.
Quirks and all.
Right.
Which I think is a great takeaway for everyone listening.
Totally. We're all about understanding your brain and then taking what we know from the research, the evidence, and using those strategies to get ahead of those procrastination impulses.
Yes. Okay, so as we wrap up, I want to leave everyone listening with a little challenge, okay? Think of one thing, any task, big or small, something you've been putting off. And then instead of letting your limbic system freak out, just choose one of the strategies we talked about. Maybe it's temptation bundling or that do-nothing method. Or maybe you just break that task down into a micro task, something you can do right now. Because even baby steps are still progress. And you never know, you might just surprise yourself with what you can get done when you work with your brain instead of against it. Until next time, keep diving deep.